Happiness did not arrive in Keanu Reeves' life with applause. It did not enter through bright doors or dramatic moments meant to be remembered by others. It did not come with certainty or celebration, nor did it ask to be recognized. It settled instead quietly into the spaces between his days, into the stillness he had once mistaken for emptiness. On a morning softened by pale gray light, Keanu sat near a wide window with a cup of coffee growing cold beside him, watching Alexandra Grant move slowly across the room. She was arranging a collection of papers and sketches for an upcoming art project, her motions unhurried, precise, and grounded, as though each action belonged exactly where it was. There was something deeply calming in the way she inhabited space, as though she never rushed to become anything other than what she already was. And for Keanu, who had spent so much of his life in motion between film sets, interviews, expectations, and long nights in unfamiliar places, her presence felt like a kind of refuge he had not known he was searching for. For years, his life had unfolded under observation. Success had come early, and with it the strange weight of being perceived before being understood. People spoke about him often, projecting stories onto his silence, mistaking restraint for mystery and composure for distance. Yet beneath those narratives was a man who had always lived gently, someone who believed deeply in listening more than speaking, in showing up quietly rather than arriving loudly. What most people never truly understood about Keanu Reeves was that happiness had never been something he associated with achievement. He had experienced acclaim, wealth, admiration, and recognition on a scale few people ever encounter. And yet he had also learned, through experiences he rarely spoke about, that none of those things could protect a person from grief, from memory, or from the quiet ache of loss. His life had taught him that if joy was to be real, it would need to be soft enough to survive sorrow, and strong enough to exist without performance. Alexandra seemed to understand that instinctively without ever asking him to explain it. She never demanded stories from him, never treated his silences as something to fix, and never asked him to demonstrate happiness as proof of anything. She met him where he was, not where the world imagined him to be. In her presence, Keanu did not feel like an idea, a symbol, or a figure shaped by public expectation. He felt human, thoughtful, imperfect, accepted. And that acceptance required no effort, no maintenance, and no defense. It existed simply because it was there. Their happiness did not form through dramatic turning points or defining declarations. It grew instead in moments that would never make headlines, in the way Alexandra listened without interrupting, in the way Keanu remembered small details about her creative process, the way certain colors unsettled her, or how certain spaces made her think more clearly, in the way they walked side by side without needing to fill the air with words. It was a happiness shaped by two people who had lived full, complicated lives before finding each other, carrying histories that were neither hidden nor romanticized, but understood. Alexandra carried her own form of resilience. She had spent much of her life navigating creative spaces that often misunderstood quiet depth in favor of spectacle, subtlety in favor of statement. She knew what it meant to exist in worlds that preferred simplification over nuance. Keanu recognized that strength almost immediately, not because it announced itself, but because it remained steady regardless of environment. There was nothing performative about her presence. Nothing that sought validation, and that steadiness drew him toward her in a way he had not experienced before. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the windows and city lights blurred into reflections on the glass, Keanu found himself thinking about how different this happiness felt. It did not resemble the excitement of beginnings or the intensity of infatuation. It carried none of the urgency that once defined love in his younger years. It was calmer, more honest, more rooted. It felt earned. And what surprised him most was not the comfort of it, but the absence of fear within it. For the first time in a long while, he was not bracing for loss, not waiting quietly for joy to recede. Alexandra had not promised permanence or spoken in grand visions of the future, yet her presence made the present feel sufficient, and that, to Keanu, felt like the most profound gift. People often spoke about him in extremes: tragic, lonely, mysterious. Those words circulated easily because they were convenient. They fit the narratives people preferred to build, but they had never captured the whole truth. The truth was that Keanu Reeves had always believed in kindness, not as an image, but as a daily practice. He believed in showing up for others quietly, in noticing, in listening, in small acts done without witnesses. Alexandra reflected those values back to him, not as admiration, but as shared orientation. Together, they created a space where empathy was not an idea but a lived experience, and where gentleness was not mistaken for weakness, but recognized as strength. Their relationship did not erase pain or rewrite the past. It did not pretend that life could be made simple. Instead, it offered something more honest, a way forward that did not deny where either of them had been. As the night deepened and the rain softened into a steady rhythm, Keanu reached for Alexandra's hand. It was not a dramatic gesture. There was no ceremony in it, only acknowledgement. She squeezed his fingers gently, understanding everything he did not say. In that moment, there was no audience, no expectation, no story being told, only two people sharing a quiet happiness shaped by trust, mutual respect, and the courage to be present. And yet Keanu knew from experience that happiness did not remain untouched simply because it was sincere. Even the most peaceful moments could be tested, not always through cruelty, but often through expectations that arrived disguised as curiosity, admiration, or concern. As weeks passed, the calm rhythm he and Alexandra had built began to encounter subtle pressures. Invitations framed as opportunities, questions posed as compliments. Conversations that gently pushed toward definitions and explanations. None of it was hostile, yet each interaction carried the same underlying suggestion that their happiness should be visible, named, clarified, or shared. Keanu felt it first as a familiar tightening in his chest, the instinct to retreat, to simplify his world by reducing access to it. He had learned long ago that withdrawal could feel like protection. Alexandra noticed the shift not because he spoke of it, but because she had become attuned to the language of his silences. This one carried unease. One afternoon, while walking through a gallery space where her latest work was being installed, Keanu stood back, watching not the art but the people moving around it. He observed the way they spoke about the pieces, often projecting their own interpretations onto work born from deeply personal experiences. He recognized the impulse immediately, because it mirrored what so many people did with him, and increasingly with their relationship, turning something real into something symbolic. Something to analyze rather than respect. Alexandra joined him quietly, standing beside him without comment. And in that stillness, Keanu realized how rare it was to be with someone who did not demand constant reassurance or emotional display. She did not ask what he was thinking. She did not attempt to redirect his mood. She simply stood there, allowing him to arrive at his own thoughts in his own time. Later that evening, as they sat together in soft light, Keanu spoke, slowly, carefully. He spoke about the weight of being observed, about how even happiness could begin to feel like something that needed protection, about how attention, even when positive, had a way of reshaping what it touched, and how he worried not for himself, but for the way constant interpretation could distort something delicate. Alexandra listened without interruption. When he finished, she did not offer solutions meant to erase his concerns. She acknowledged them. She spoke gently about boundaries, not as walls meant to shut people out, but as definitions that allow something meaningful to survive. She spoke of her own experiences navigating spaces where her work was judged before it was understood, and how that had taught her that authenticity required intention. Happiness, she believed, did not need validation. And love did not grow stronger by being constantly explained. Her words settled into Keanu not as comfort, but as relief, because for the first time, he felt he was not carrying the responsibility of protection alone. As days turned into weeks, they began to adjust, not by withdrawing from the world, but by choosing carefully how much of themselves they offered it. They learned to say no without guilt, to protect quiet moments without apology, to trust that what mattered did not need to be constantly visible. Keanu felt something soften inside him, a vigilance shaped by years of experience. Alexandra too felt the shift, realizing that partnership did not require compromise of self, but alignment of values. And yet, growth rarely arrives without discomfort. One evening, after a long stretch of obligations, Keanu returned home visibly drained. Not angry, vulnerable. He spoke of his fear of slowly losing what they had built, not through conflict, but through erosion. Alexandra met that vulnerability with patience, reminding him that fear did not negate happiness. That awareness did not diminish love. She spoke of choosing presence daily, of resilience as something practiced, not achieved. That night, sitting together in silence, Keanu understood something that had long eluded him. Happiness was not something to defend aggressively or hide carefully. It was something to tend gently, something living. And Alexandra had not entered his life to shield him from the world, nor to be sheltered from it, but to walk beside him within it. And for the first time, he felt he was not facing life as an individual bracing for impact, but as part of a partnership grounded in empathy, honesty, and shared intention. Their happiness, he realized, was not fragile. It was simply quiet, and in a world addicted to noise, quiet strength was often misunderstood. Yet together, they were beginning to learn that the most enduring joy does not announce itself. It reveals itself slowly, through consistency, through kindness, through the courage to remain open. There comes a point in every genuine happiness when its true nature is revealed not in how it feels during calm, but in how it holds when calm is disturbed. For Keanu Reeves, that realization did not arrive as a dramatic event, nor did it announce itself through conflict. It emerged gradually through subtle shifts in atmosphere, through ordinary days that began to carry an unfamiliar weight. Attention had always surrounded him, but now it moved differently. It lingered. It observed. It interpreted, and increasingly it reached beyond him, brushing against the life he shared with Alexandra. He felt it in the way rooms paused when they entered together, in the way conversations bent gently toward them, in the way curiosity wore the clothing of admiration. None of it was cruel, yet none of it was neutral. It carried expectations, and expectations, he had learned, could quietly reshape even the most sincere experiences. Keanu noticed the change first within himself, not as fear but as awareness. A subtle alertness returning to his body, the same instinct that had once taught him to guard his inner world carefully. For many years, solitude had been his refuge, not because he rejected connection, but because he understood the cost of exposure. He had lived long enough to know that being seen did not always mean being understood, and that sometimes the world did not merely witness happiness, but attempted to define it, simplify it, and assign it meaning that did not belong to it. Now, with Alexandra beside him, that instinct reawakened, not because he wished to retreat from her, but because he wanted to protect what they had built from becoming something it was never meant to be. Alexandra sensed this shift without being told. She noticed it in the way his energy changed at the edges of their days, in the way he grew quieter after certain obligations, in how his presence sometimes carried thought instead of rest. She did not confront it directly, nor did she attempt to ease it prematurely. She had long believed that emotions, when respected, often reveal their own truths. One evening, as they walked slowly through a familiar neighborhood, the air cool and still, she spoke not about him, but about her own experiences. About the way attention could feel like warmth and pressure at the same time. About how even sincere interest could become intrusive when it no longer recognized limits. She described how she had learned over the years to distinguish between engagement and access, between sharing and surrendering. And as Keanu listened, he realized she was offering him not advice but understanding. That conversation stayed with him. It lingered in the spaces between their interactions, shaping the way he reflected on his own responses. He began to recognize how easily he had once allowed external perception to influence internal posture, how often he had adjusted himself unconsciously to remain unexamined. With Alexandra, he was learning a different approach, not withdrawal but discernment, not concealment but clarity. And this distinction felt important, because it allowed him to remain emotionally present without becoming emotionally available to every expectation that approached him. The testing of this understanding did not come all at once. It unfolded through invitations framed as honors, through conversations that gently pressed toward definitions, through moments where their shared presence seemed to carry meaning beyond their own experience of it. Keanu felt the familiar temptation to simplify his life again by narrowing it, by reducing the points of contact between what mattered to him and what the world wished to observe. Yet something had changed. Alexandra's presence had altered the internal conditions under which he made such decisions. Instead of reacting, he found himself pausing, reflecting, asking not what would create the least discomfort, but what would best align with the values he was trying to live. One afternoon, after a long stretch of commitments, he returned home visibly fatigued, carrying the quiet residue of conversations that asked him, subtly but persistently, to define happiness as something declarative and easily summarized. Alexandra greeted him not with questions, but with space. She allowed him to move through the room, to sit, to settle, to arrive back into himself before speaking. And when he did speak, it was not about the day itself, but about the undercurrent beneath it. He admitted how tiring it felt to watch something real become something speculative, how exhausting it was to sense that their happiness was often treated as a narrative rather than a lived experience. He spoke of his fear not of conflict, but of erosion, of the slow reshaping of something delicate into something performative. Alexandra listened in the way she always did, attentively and without interruption, not preparing responses, not redirecting his words, but allowing them to unfold fully. When he finished, she did not minimize what he felt, nor did she attempt to reassure him out of it. Instead, she acknowledged the complexity of what he was describing. She spoke of the difference between privacy and isolation, between protecting something and shrinking it. She reminded him that boundaries were not signs of fear, but expressions of care. That choosing how to engage was not avoidance, but authorship. Her words did not offer certainty, but they offered something more sustainable: perspective. Over the following weeks, their life together began to reflect a series of quiet, intentional choices. They did not retreat from the world, nor did they open themselves indiscriminately to it. They learned to say no without explanation, to accept invitations that aligned with their values and decline those that did not, to protect certain moments without framing that protection as secrecy. Keanu found that this approach softened something inside him that had been tense for years, a vigilance shaped by the belief that happiness required constant guarding. With Alexandra, he was learning that happiness, when rooted in shared values, often requires less defense than trust. Yet trust, he was discovering, was not passive. It was practiced, it asked for attention, and it was often exercised most deeply in moments of fatigue. One evening after a particularly long day, the weariness he carried settled between them not as distance but as vulnerability. He spoke about the old parts of himself that still associated exposure with loss, that still believed retreat was safer than engagement. Alexandra did not counter those instincts. She honored them. And then she gently invited him to consider whether they still served the life he was now building, whether caution could coexist with openness without becoming closure, whether gentleness could remain intact without requiring disappearance. That conversation did not resolve anything neatly. It was not meant to. It opened space. And in that space, something within Keanu shifted. He realized that happiness was not asking him to abandon his nature, but to inhabit it differently, to allow reflection to replace reaction, to let discernment guide rather than fear. Alexandra's presence beside him did not remove uncertainty, but it changed how he met it. He no longer felt he was navigating the complexities of attention alone. He felt accompanied, not as someone being protected, but as someone being understood. As the days continued, Keanu began to notice how this internal change affected even the smallest interactions. He felt less compelled to correct assumptions, less reactive to speculation, less burdened by the idea that he owed the world clarity. Instead, he returned again and again to the simple reality of his daily life, to the way Alexandra moved through their shared spaces, to the conversations that unfolded without urgency, to the quiet meals that required no commentary. And in those ordinary moments, he found something remarkably grounding, a sense that what mattered most was not being altered by what was being observed. Alexandra, too, experienced growth within this period, not because she sought it, but because partnership, when lived consciously, often reveals parts of oneself previously unexamined. She became increasingly aware of how often strength was misunderstood as resistance and softness as vulnerability. With Keanu, she saw how gentleness could be active, how presence could be a form of stability, how choosing not to engage could sometimes be the most deliberate response of all. Their conversations deepened not through intensity but through reflection. They spoke of values, of intention, of the ways people often confuse exposure with authenticity, and through those conversations their connection grew not louder but more anchored. There came a quiet moment one evening as they sat together after a long day, when Keanu realized that this period of subtle testing had not weakened what they shared. It had clarified it. He felt a sense of gratitude not rooted in relief, but in recognition. Recognition that happiness, when sincere, is not something preserved by avoiding difficulty, but something strengthened by meeting it honestly. He saw how their choices, though small, were shaping an emotional environment built not on reaction, but on alignment. And that alignment felt deeply stabilizing. In that understanding, Keanu began to experience a different relationship with uncertainty. He no longer perceived it as a threat to happiness, but as a condition of being alive. Alexandra had not entered his life to simplify it. She had entered it to share it. And in that sharing, he found himself more willing to remain open even when it would have been easier to close. More willing to stay gentle even when the world leaned toward urgency. More willing to trust that what he and Alexandra were building did not require constant protection because it was being consciously tended. Their happiness, he realized, was not fragile. It was simply living. and living things do not remain unchanged. They grow, they adapt, they deepen, and as they do, they reveal not only what they are, but what they are capable of becoming. There is a particular kind of courage that rarely draws attention. It does not announce itself through dramatic decisions or visible acts of defiance. It lives quietly in the daily choice to remain soft in a world that constantly rewards hardness, to remain open in a culture that often teaches retreat, and to remain kind when it would be easier to become distant. For Keanu Reeves, this courage had always existed somewhere within him, shaped by the many chapters of his life. But it was only now, in this season he shared with Alexandra, that he began to recognize it not as instinct alone, but as a discipline. Something practiced, something renewed, something that asked for presence each day. The world continued, as it always had, to orbit around him with its expectations, projections, and rhythms. Yet the way he experienced it had begun to shift in ways he could not have articulated even a year earlier. There was a growing awareness within him that happiness did not require insulation from complexity. It required the ability to move through complexity without losing gentleness. And this awareness reshaped the way he met even the smallest moments of his life. He found himself listening more attentively, not only to Alexandra, but to himself, noticing when tension arose, not dismissing it, not allowing it to dictate his actions either. Instead, he sat with it, allowing it to inform reflection rather than reaction. Alexandra played a quiet but profound role in this internal evolution, not because she guided it, but because she embodied the qualities he was learning to trust. She approached her work and her life with a steadiness that did not resist difficulty, but did not dramatize it either. She moved through days with an attentiveness that honored both the emotional and the practical, neither neglecting depth nor becoming consumed by it. Watching her, Keanu became increasingly aware of how much energy he had once spent anticipating loss, misunderstanding, or retreat, and how that anticipation had shaped him into someone careful to the point of invisibility. With Alexandra, he was not asked to abandon that care, only to allow it to coexist with presence. One evening, as they sat together after a long day, the conversation turned not toward the world outside, but inward. Keanu spoke about the way his life had taught him to associate emotional openness with vulnerability that often went unanswered. He reflected on how loss, when experienced without resolution, can quietly instruct a person to conserve feeling rather than express it. Alexandra listened without trying to interpret his words, and when she responded, she did so with the same measured honesty that characterized her presence. She spoke about how gentleness was often misunderstood as an absence of strength, when in reality it required a constant choice, a willingness to remain receptive even when experience suggested otherwise. Her words resonated with Keanu not as reassurance, but as recognition, because they described something he had lived but had not named. From that point forward, he began to view his own restraint differently, not as something that limited him, but as something that could, if shaped intentionally, become a source of depth. He realized that he did not need to transform himself into someone expressive in ways that felt unnatural. What he needed was to trust that openness could exist quietly. That vulnerability did not require visibility. That connection could be cultivated not only through words, but through consistency, attentiveness, and the small gestures that accumulate into understanding. As weeks passed, Keanu noticed how this shift affected even the way he moved through public moments. He felt less compelled to present a version of himself that fit expectation, less inclined to correct narratives or adjust to interpretations. Instead, he allowed himself to be present without managing perception. This did not mean disengaging. It meant releasing the belief that every moment required translation. Alexandra supported this not by encouraging distance, but by remaining rooted in her own steadiness, reminding him through action rather than instruction that one can remain accessible without becoming exposed. There were moments when old instincts surfaced, when the familiar urge to withdraw emerged in response to fatigue or misinterpretation. Yet now, those moments became opportunities for reflection rather than retreat. Keanu began to ask himself not how to escape discomfort, but how to remain gentle within it. This question changed the texture of his inner world. He found himself approaching uncertainty with curiosity rather than defense. He noticed that when he allowed himself to stay emotionally present, even while maintaining boundaries, tension softened more quickly. The need for control diminished, and in its place emerged something quieter but more stable: trust. Alexandra's influence in this process was not directive. She did not offer him methods or affirmations. She offered him presence, and that presence, consistent and grounded, created a space where he could explore these internal shifts without pressure. Their shared time became less about managing circumstances and more about inhabiting them. They spoke often, not about what they were building, but about how they were living, about the values they returned to when choices became complex, about the ways kindness could be practiced in environments that often confused it with naivety. Through these conversations, Keanu came to understand that gentleness, when chosen deliberately, was not passive. It was a form of engagement that refused to let external conditions dictate internal posture. One morning, as light filtered quietly into the room and the city stirred awake outside, Keanu found himself reflecting on how deeply his sense of happiness had evolved. He no longer viewed it as something that arrived or departed. He saw it instead as a way of relating to experience, a way of meeting both ease and difficulty without losing coherence. Alexandra's presence had not removed uncertainty from his life, but it had changed the emotional climate in which uncertainty existed. It now appeared less as a threat and more as a reminder of movement, of growth, of life unfolding. He realized then that the happiness he felt was not rooted in circumstance, but in orientation, in the daily return to empathy, in the decision to listen, in the willingness to remain open even when no outcome was guaranteed. And this understanding brought with it a quiet confidence, not confidence in permanence, but confidence in his capacity to meet change without abandoning himself. Alexandra, observing this evolution, experienced her own reflections. She saw in Keanu not a man becoming someone new, but a man allowing more of himself to be inhabited. She recognized the courage in his gentleness, the discipline in his restraint, the depth in his listening. Their connection grew not through intensity, but through attunement, through the subtle adjustments that occur when two people choose to meet each other not from roles, but from presence. As time continued, Keanu began to understand that happiness did not require constant affirmation to remain real. It required attention, it required intention, and it required the humility to accept that meaning is rarely static. With Alexandra, he was learning that love, when grounded in respect, becomes less about emotional exchange and more about shared orientation, about how two people choose to move through the world, how they respond to pressure, how they remain gentle when the environment suggests hardness. And in this learning, he discovered something that felt both new and deeply familiar, a sense of internal alignment, a feeling that his values were no longer ideas he aspired to but practices he lived. Kindness, patience, presence. These were no longer traits he hoped to embody, they were rhythms shaping his days. The courage to remain gentle, he realized, was not a singular act. It was a continuous one, renewed each morning, practiced in each conversation, chosen in each moment when reaction offered itself before reflection. Alexandra's companionship did not remove this responsibility, it illuminated it. And through that illumination, Keanu found himself less preoccupied with guarding happiness and more devoted to honoring it. Because happiness, when rooted in gentleness, does not demand to be protected. It asks to be practiced. And in that practice, it grows not louder but deeper. There are seasons in life when change arrives not as a single event, but as an accumulation of moments that subtly alter the emotional atmosphere of one's days. For Keanu Reeves, this season did not announce itself loudly. It revealed itself through a growing density in the spaces he moved through a sense that the world, without hostility yet without restraint, was leaning closer. Attention did not merely surround him, it lingered, it followed, it waited. And increasingly, it carried an expectation that what he and Alexandra shared should mean something beyond itself, that their presence together should be interpreted, contextualized, and shaped into a narrative that belonged not to them, but to the imaginations of others. This awareness did not frighten him, but it required something from him, a deepening of the internal clarity he had begun to cultivate. He noticed the shift most distinctly in moments meant to be ordinary, in rooms where conversations softened as they entered, in gatherings where glances assembled meaning before words were spoken, in the subtle choreography of public spaces where their movement together seemed to draw invisible lines of attention. Keanu had lived in this orbit for much of his adult life, yet this time felt different. Not because the attention was more intense, but because it extended beyond him. It brushed against Alexandra's life, her work, her creative space. And that awareness stirred within him a protectiveness that was not reactive, but reflective. He did not want to shield her from the world. He wanted to remain worthy of the way she met it. Alexandra experienced this season not as intrusion, but as context. She had long navigated environments where observation was inevitable, where creative expression invited interpretation. What differed now was the way her personal presence was increasingly framed in relation to someone else. She recognized the subtle erosion that can occur when a person's identity is slowly reshaped by proximity to attention rather than by the integrity of their own work. And so she approached this shift with intention. She remained grounded in her creative practice. She continued to structure her days around meaning rather than momentum. And in doing so, she offered Keanu something profoundly stabilizing, an example of how to remain oneself without resistance, without retreat, and without performance. There came a period when obligations clustered closely together, when their shared time was interwoven with commitments that required presence beyond the private world they had carefully cultivated. Keanu felt the familiar fatigue of being seen in ways that did not always reflect reality. He noticed how easily observation could turn into interpretation, and how quickly interpretation could solidify into assumption. In earlier years, he might have responded by narrowing his world, by simplifying it through withdrawal. Now, however, he found himself drawn instead toward conversation, toward articulation, toward sharing the experience not with the world but with Alexandra. One evening, after a long day, they sat together in the quiet of their shared space. The world outside continued its movement, distant and indifferent, while inside, something gentler unfolded. Keanu spoke not about specific moments, but about the sensation beneath them. About how attention, even when kind, can feel heavy when it begins to shape the emotional environment of one's life. About how he sometimes feared that the simplest expressions of presence between them could be mistaken for statements meant for others. Alexandra listened carefully, her attention neither tense nor detached. When she responded, she did not attempt to resolve what he felt. She acknowledged it. She spoke about how meaning, when left undefined, often invites projection, and how projection says less about the subject than about the needs of those doing the projecting. She reminded him that they could not control the stories others created, but they could remain deliberate in the way they lived their own. From that conversation emerged a series of small, consistent choices. They did not frame them as strategies. They experienced them as alignment. They began to define their rhythms more clearly, protecting certain spaces not out of fear but out of respect. They chose presence where presence felt nourishing. They chose privacy where privacy felt necessary. They trusted that what was real would remain so without constant explanation. And in this trust, Keanu felt a quiet strength begin to consolidate within him, a sense that he was no longer moving in response to pressure, but in accordance with principle. There were moments when the world pressed closer, when assumptions circulated, when curiosity reached toward interpretation. Yet now those moments did not find him unanchored. He noticed them. He felt them. But he did not allow them to displace the emotional center he was cultivating. Alexandra's steadiness beside him reinforced this center, not by shielding him from complexity, but by reminding him, through her way of being, that complexity could be met without losing gentleness. As this season continued, Keanu became increasingly aware of how deeply this relationship was reshaping his understanding of strength. For much of his life, strength had been associated with endurance, with carrying quietly, with not imposing one's inner world upon others. Those instincts remained within him, yet they were being integrated into something broader. He was learning that strength could also mean staying present when it would be easier to disappear. That it could mean allowing oneself to be affected without becoming unmoored. That it could mean choosing softness not as default, but as decision. Alexandra embodied this dimension of strength in ways that felt deeply instructive. She approached complexity not with defense, but with clarity. She did not seek to correct every misunderstanding, nor did she accept the reshaping of her identity by external narratives. She remained anchored in her work, in her rhythms, in her understanding of what mattered. Watching her, Keanu saw how strength could be lived quietly without becoming invisible, how it could remain open without becoming exposed. And in that example, he found both reassurance and inspiration. There came a moment, unremarkable from the outside, yet significant internally, when Keanu realized that this period of intensified observation had not diminished what they shared. It had refined it. He felt a gratitude that did not arise from relief, but from recognition. Recognition that their happiness was not dependent on favorable conditions. It was shaped by how they responded to those conditions. And what they were building was not a refuge from the world, but a way of being within it. As the days unfolded, Keanu noticed how his internal dialogue had changed. He no longer asked how to protect happiness from the world. He asked how to honor it within the world. This shift, subtle yet profound, altered the emotional texture of his life. It freed him from the impulse to brace against experience. It allowed him to meet both ease and challenge with a steadiness he had not previously known. Alexandra's presence did not remove uncertainty. It contextualized it. It reminded him that uncertainty, when approached with empathy, could become movement rather than threat. Their shared life continued, composed of ordinary moments that carried extraordinary depth. Conversations that unfolded without urgency. Silences that did not need filling. Days that did not require narrative. And within those days, Keanu felt something solidifying. Not a conclusion, not a resolution, but a foundation. A sense that what he and Alexandra were living was not a reaction to the world's attention, but an independent reality capable of withstanding it. When the world pressed closer, they did not retreat. They stood more clearly. They chose more carefully. They remained more gently. And in that gentleness, a quiet, enduring strength continued to take shape. There's a quiet turning point that comes not when life becomes easier, but when the inner posture with which one meets life begins to soften. For Keanu Reeves, this turning point did not announce itself as a realization he could clearly name. It revealed itself instead through a growing ease within his own awareness, a subtle loosening of the vigilance that had accompanied him for so many years. The world had not become less complex. Attention had not receded. Expectations had not vanished. And yet the emotional weight they carried had begun to shift. What once felt like something he had to manage now felt like something he could simply acknowledge. And within that shift, something deeper than comfort began to take root. Trust. This trust did not form suddenly, nor was it directed outward. It grew inward first, as a quiet confidence in his own capacity to remain aligned with what mattered regardless of circumstance. Alexandra's presence had nurtured this confidence not by protecting him from uncertainty, but by standing with him within it. Their shared life continued to unfold through ordinary days that asked for no audience. Days shaped by work, reflection, conversation, and stillness. And it was within these unremarkable hours that Keanu found himself experiencing a form of happiness he had never known before. Not the happiness of relief, not the happiness of escape, but the happiness of internal coherence. A sense that his outer life and inner values were no longer negotiating with each other, but moving in quiet agreement. He noticed this most clearly in moments when old patterns might once have taken hold. Situations that could have stirred self-consciousness or encouraged retreat now met him differently. He remained attentive but not braced, thoughtful but not withdrawn. It was not that he felt untouched by pressure. It was that pressure no longer dictated his emotional direction. Alexandra's steadiness beside him reinforced this change not through words, but through the consistency of her way of being. She did not react to shifts in atmosphere. She responded to reality. She did not anticipate misunderstanding. She clarified her own orientation, and in doing so, she quietly demonstrated what it meant to trust one's internal compass. Their conversations during this time often turned toward reflection rather than circumstance. They spoke about how meaning evolves, about how the most honest connections are rarely those that feel dramatic, but those that remain stable through change. Keanu found himself sharing thoughts he had carried for years, but had never fully articulated, reflections shaped by a life lived under observation, by experiences that had taught him both the beauty and the fragility of connection. Alexandra listened as she always did, without attempting to gather his words into conclusions, allowing them instead to exist as expressions. And within that listening, Keanu felt something settle, a recognition that being heard did not require being interpreted, that being understood did not demand being summarized. This deepening sense of trust began to influence not only how he related to the world, but how he related to his own happiness. For much of his life, happiness had been something he approached carefully, aware of how quickly it could be disrupted, how easily it could be mistaken for permanence. He had learned to appreciate moments without building expectations around them. Now, however, he found himself no longer watching happiness as something that might depart, but inhabiting it as something that could evolve. He was not assuming continuity, he was allowing it, and this distinction mattered, because allowing did not require defense, it required presence. Alexandra experienced this evolution as well, though she expressed it differently. She felt a growing clarity in the way they navigated both shared and individual spaces. There was an ease between them that did not depend on constant affirmation or emotional exchange. They respected each other's rhythms, each other's work, each other's interior worlds. And within that respect, connection did not thin. It strengthened, because it was not sustained by proximity alone but by recognition. They did not need to hold on to each other tightly to feel secure. They trusted the alignment they were cultivating. There were evenings when they sat together without agenda, without conversation, simply occupying the same space. And in those silences, Keanu felt something that once might have unsettled him. Stillness. But now, stillness did not feel like absence. It felt like fullness. A sense that nothing was missing, that nothing needed to be added. That life in that moment was complete enough. He realized then that happiness had quietly shifted from something he noticed to something he lived. It no longer stood apart from him as an experience. It had become a way of inhabiting his days. This way of being extended gradually into all corners of his life. He approached his work with the same attentiveness he brought to his relationships, not seeking distraction but engagement. He listened more deeply. He chose more deliberately. He allowed space for nuance where once he might have sought clarity, and in doing so he found himself less fatigued by the need to resolve things. He no longer felt compelled to arrive at conclusions about his own life. He was content to continue exploring it. Alexandra's influence in this period was not something Keanu experienced as change imposed from outside. It felt instead like permission. Permission to inhabit himself without tension. Permission to trust the emotional ground he was standing on. Permission to allow happiness to exist without conditions. She did not offer him certainty. She offered him companionship in uncertainty. And that companionship transformed uncertainty from something to endure into something to move through. As time passed, Keanu became aware of a growing sense of gratitude that did not attach itself to specific outcomes. He felt grateful not because life had become easier, but because it had become more coherent. The pieces of his experience no longer felt in competition with each other. Public and private, past and present, solitude and connection. They were no longer divided. They were integrated. And in that integration, he found peace not as an emotional high, but as an underlying steadiness. There came a quiet afternoon when this understanding crystallized within him. They had spent the day apart, each immersed in their own work, and reunited in the early evening without urgency. They spoke casually at first about ordinary things, and then without intention the conversation softened into something more reflective. Keanu realized as he listened to Alexandra speak that he was not anticipating where her words would lead. He was not preparing responses. He was simply present. And in that presence, he recognized a form of trust he had not known he was capable of. Trust not only in her, but in the moment itself. Trust that nothing needed to be shaped. Trust that meaning would emerge without direction. In that realization, he understood that happiness, when allowed to mature, becomes less about emotional satisfaction and more about emotional grounding. It ceases to be something one feels and becomes something one stands within. And standing within it, one no longer asks whether it will last. One asks how to live in a way that honors it. Their life together continued, not toward a defined future, but within a shared orientation. They returned again and again to kindness as practice, to patience as posture, to gentleness as choice, and in those returns their happiness learned to trust, not because it was assured, but because it was rooted. Rooted in respect. Rooted in empathy. Rooted in the quiet courage to remain present. And in that rootedness, Keanu felt a form of joy that did not fluctuate with circumstance. A joy that did not ask to be protected. A joy that simply asked to be lived. There is a form of joy that does not fade when attention shifts, that does not weaken when circumstances change, and that does not demand constant reassurance to remain alive. It is not built from intensity nor sustained by excitement. It grows instead from continuity, from the repeated choice to meet life with presence, from the discipline of kindness, and from the humility to allow meaning to evolve. For Keanu Reeves, this form of joy did not arrive as a revelation. It revealed itself over time, through days that no longer felt divided between what was lived and what was endured. And as he moved forward beside Alexandra, he became increasingly aware that what he was experiencing was not a moment of happiness, but a way of being. Life had not become simpler. The world had not grown quieter. Responsibilities remained. Attention continued. Change still moved steadily through his days, yet none of these forces now defined the emotional tone of his inner world. What defined it was something far more subtle and far more resilient, an underlying sense of alignment, a feeling that he was no longer orienting himself against experience, but within it. Alexandra's presence beside him did not remove complexity from his life. It illuminated how to inhabit it, and within that illumination, he found that joy could remain even as circumstances shifted. He noticed this most in the smallest moments, in the way mornings unfolded without urgency, in the way conversations drifted naturally from the practical to the reflective, in the ease with which silence now rested between them, no longer something to pass through, but something to share. These were not moments that would be remembered individually, yet together they formed a continuity that reshaped his understanding of fulfillment. Happiness was no longer an experience he identified. It was the emotional climate within which experience occurred. Alexandra, too, felt this quiet continuity shaping her days. She experienced their life together not as a refuge from the world, but as a grounded center from which to engage it. She continued her work with clarity, allowing her creative practice to remain an independent expression rather than a reflection of circumstance. And in doing so, she preserved something essential not only to herself, but to their partnership. A sense that love, when lived consciously, does not absorb identity. It respects it, it does not simplify complexity, it accommodates it. Their connection had grown not by eliminating difference, but by understanding it. They did not seek to mirror each other. They sought to stand alongside each other. And in that orientation, something enduring had taken shape. A form of companionship that did not rely on constant affirmation, but on consistent regard. They listened. They reflected. They adjusted. They chose. And through these choices, their relationship became less about emotion exchanged and more about values enacted. There came a quiet evening when Keanu found himself reflecting on how profoundly his internal landscape had changed. He realized that he no longer carried the subtle anticipation that happiness must eventually retreat, not because he believed it would remain unchanged, but because he understood that change no longer implied loss. He had learned that meaning could persist through evolution. That connection could deepen through uncertainty. That joy could remain even as it transformed. And this understanding freed him from the need to protect happiness as a fragile state. He no longer held it. He participated in it. Alexandra sensed this internal settling. She saw it in the way he moved through his days, in the way he approached both responsibility and rest, in the way he listened without needing to solve, in the way he spoke without needing to conclude. Their conversations increasingly reflected this shared orientation. They spoke less about what their life meant and more about how they were living it. They returned often to questions of kindness, of attention, of how to remain gentle in environments that often confused urgency with importance. And through these reflections, they reinforced the emotional culture they were building together. What Keanu understood now, with a clarity that felt both new and deeply familiar, was that happiness was not something that remained untouched because it was sincere. It remained because it was practiced, because it was returned to, because it was shaped daily through intention. He saw how each choice they made either strengthened or diluted the emotional environment they shared. And in recognizing this, he experienced a renewed sense of responsibility not as burden, but as privilege. The privilege of tending something meaningful. There were days, of course, when fatigue surfaced, when uncertainty made itself known, when the world's pace brushed against their quieter rhythm. Yet even in those days, the underlying steadiness remained. They had learned how to meet difficulty without dramatizing it, how to acknowledge pressure without surrendering to it, how to remain open without becoming unanchored. And this learning had altered the emotional architecture of their lives. One morning, as light settled gently into the room and the city awakened beyond the window, Keanu watched Alexandra move through a familiar ritual, preparing for the day ahead. Nothing about the moment was exceptional, and yet within it, he felt the fullness of what they had cultivated, a sense of peace not rooted in circumstance, but in orientation. A feeling that he was no longer measuring his life against expectations, but inhabiting it according to values. And within that inhabitation, joy did not fluctuate, it remained. He realized then that the happiness he shared with Alexandra did not belong to a story. It did not resolve into an ending. It did not seek recognition. It existed in the steady unfolding of days, in the way they returned again and again to respect, empathy, and presence. It lived in their willingness to remain gentle even when the world suggested hardness, in their choice to remain reflective even when the world moved quickly, in their commitment to remain human in spaces that often rewarded performance. This happiness did not promise permanence. It did not deny loss. It did not eliminate uncertainty. What it offered instead was something far more enduring, a way of moving through life together that honored both strength and vulnerability, both independence and connection, both quiet and expression. And within this way of moving, Keanu found something he had not known he was seeking, not fulfillment as achievement, but fulfillment as coherence. As time continued, carrying its inevitable changes, he no longer asked what happiness would become. He trusted what it was, a living, evolving presence shaped by daily choices. And Alexandra beside him was not a symbol of that happiness. She was a participant in it, a companion in its unfolding complexity, a reminder that love, when lived with intention, does not arrive as resolution. It arrives as relationship. And so their story did not conclude. It continued, without announcement, without definition, without spectacle. It continued in the steady practice of kindness, in the discipline of attention, in the courage to remain gentle. And in that continuation, Keanu Reeves found a joy that did not depend on the world's response. A joy that remained. A joy that deepened. A joy that did not need to be explained.